Terry Price, who is fairly new to Edmonton still, has just moved here and has some great experience as a teacher and former president of the Canadian Teachers Federation. Okay, we need you to calm down now.
Fine so far.
Quiet in the room.
You're fine.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to bring up Terry Price, the former president of the Canadian Teachers Federation, and she's got a long resume that I'm not going to read, but Terry is one of the things that she's done with us in the short time she's been in Alberta is encouraged us to get these small booklets that are included in your package about reconciliation and the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And she's just going to say a few words about why we have those in there and what you can use them for. So please, Terry.
Thanks, Joel. I'm sure you found these in your folder. They are produced by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm sure Charlene Bearhead had something to do with that before she left that organization. Just a guess, but pretty sure. Anyways, I don't know about, well, I would guess the majority of the people in this room have a similar education to what I had in the public school system. I'm embarrassed and very disappointed that the history I learned was a false history, a false narrative of our country. It's taken me 40 years, and I was teaching when I first started my journey to learn more about our true history. And I think you will find this little booklet very, very helpful. It's not only the calls to action, but it's bookended by the principles of reconciliation. And you'll notice that the very first one refers to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how that should be a guide for everything that we do. And there is currently a private member's bill in front of Parliament at the moment, put forward by MP Romeo Shaganash, Bill C-262. It needs all of our support, and we should be out there advocating for that to ensure that our laws are harmonized with UNDRIP. This N section in the book is UNDRIP itself, so that United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I've just recently retired from the Manitoba Teachers Society, hence Joel's reference to my moving here. I came here because my sons are here. But what we did with this booklet, and any organization can do it, was go through those 94 calls to action. Which ones are most relevant to your line of work? So naturally we were able to go through and pick out the ones that within the education realm where we worked as a union, where our members were day-to-day in our schools, which ones can we make a difference on? And it's part of our mandate, and we can make a difference. So we did that as a professional organization, but then each of our individual teachers can also use the ones where they have some impact. So, and I'm great at numbers. We took number 8, number 10, number 57, 62, 63, and 66. Those were our 6 priority items. And I would suggest that almost everybody in this room could look at number 57, and that would be an excellent one for you to work within your community, professionally and personally, to ensure that you take steps towards that. And that's about increasing the awareness and the education of every person that works with the public on understanding the true history and the impact of that history on our current society. We heard Alex last night talking about how we bridge the divides that we have, how with our very diverse society, we need to come together and create a whole. This booklet will help when it comes to our work as a community and a society with our Indigenous history. So I strongly encourage you to take a really good look through it. You can get more copies through NCTR. It's located at the University of Manitoba. I would also challenge the University of Manitoba to reduce the price so that it is more accessible, so that we can have these in the hands of everybody, so that we can move forward in reconciliation. So thank you for your time.
And Public Interest Alberta did purchase all of those, and they're mainly paid for through the fees that you register for in the conference as well. So if you didn't get a copy of that, I think we had a couple maybe fall out of packages. So if you don't have a copy, I think we have some more at the front desk. And you don't necessarily need it during this session. I don't know, maybe you do. But you can grab it at lunch break for sure. With that, I'm going to bring up Mike Parker, the president of the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. He's a close friend of the organization, and HSAA is as an organization too. Mike, please come up and introduce the next session.
Thanks, Will. You know, it's funny, it's been a few years that I've been coming to Parkland, and this morning I was talking to one of our members, and she says, you know what, this is my first time here, and I'm probably good to head home now because I have been made aware. And she ended it with that. She said, I have been made aware. And I thought, well, in the last 12 hours that we've been going through this Parkland, or the PIA group here, we've already made one of my colleagues aware. And that's what we're talking about here, is making us understand where we're at and where we need to head in the future. And you know, growing up, I was a child of a family of public sector workers. My grandfather worked in the prison in Kingston, Ontario. And when he would go to work, he would meet with all of his cons, I guess you'd call them back in those days, you know. And he would say, you know, when you're being set back into society, I know you're coming back, and when you do, bring a friend. Now, we've talked about signing your membership forms, so I'm going to ask all of you today, when you come back next year, bring a friend. Being growing up in the family I did, my dad worked in the telephone company. Last night, as we were going through conversations, there was a few shout-outs from the crowd, and we were talking about the privatization of this province back in the 90s. And somebody shouted out Edmonton Public Telephones. I don't know if that person's still here. And somebody shouted out AGT back in those days. And I remember the liquor stores. And I remember all the other things, the highways that were privatized. And I also remember getting Ralph Bucks. And I'll tell you what, I think as a youngster in those days, I spent my Ralph Bucks probably on speakers for my car. And I never put the connection together between those Ralph Bucks and my dad losing his job, Coaldale Hospital closing down, and folks losing their house. And that was the reality back then. And I didn't make those connections. And it's up to us to start putting that stuff back together again as we head into next year. Today's topic, we're going to discuss particularly something that's close to my heart and the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. Nearly every member of our board and senior staff recently spent a day at Blue Quills, formerly a residential school located in St. Paul, Alberta. So it's a tough day. We heard directly from the survivors of that school what life was like there. We heard about all of the tortured children at those times. We heard about the graves of the children who didn't survive. We heard about families ripped apart by the officials of a state that didn't really care if they lived or died, that actively worked towards the destruction of the culture and the language. We also heard how those who survived are now working to heal those wounds. They took over that school. They now teach university courses in first language, and they teach their communities about what happened at residential schools and how the effects of their communities still lingers. It was uncomfortable, but it was a very important experience. However, there's also the reaching out to non-Indigenous Canadians to teach them about the dark chapter in our country's history. They understand that unless all of us hear the truth, then none of this can be reconciled. We were so inspired by what we saw at Blue Quills that we made it mandatory for all of our HSA staff, about 70 members, to spend the day there learning. And today we continue to send cohorts of our membership back up to Blue Quills to have an experience there. At HSA we raised the Treaty 6 and Métis flags in front of our Edmonton building, recognizing that the traditional lands in which we perform our work. We've struck a committee to examine the ways we as a union can implement the recommendations of the TNR Commission. Today we're looking forward to the discussion about how to have that implementation, reconciliation, conversation in this province. Our speakers this morning will be Charlene Bearhead, an expert educator. She's an education coordinator for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and an education consultant to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, among other positions. Jennifer Tupper is the Dean of the Faculty of Education, University of Alberta. She has researched citizen education, treaty education, and anti-colonial education, and is currently focused on how schools can become sites of truth and reconciliation. Lewis Cardinal is a communicator, educator, who spent much of his life building relationships that cross cultural divides. He has a track record of public service on various bodies that are far too long to list in this full. That includes being the co-chair of the Aboriginal Commission on Human Rights and Justice, and a trustee on the Council of Parliament on World Religions. I think we're going to have an inspiring talk today, so please give them a warm welcome to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us and for being willing to have this conversation. First of all, I'd like to say, Redwashing, just on behalf of the three of us, I just want to acknowledge that we are happy to be here at home for all of us, which is not always the case and often the case, but that we're all here at home in Treaty 6 territory, traditional territory of the Cree, Nakota, and homeland of the Métis, so, and the Dene, by the way. So happy to be here. It was really interesting as we were listening to the panel that came before, and I thought, oh, that's so interesting how some of the things, that are really still so common for the things that we deal with every day. And it's interesting that really this is just a conversation, because all we have to do here is talk to you about our lives and what we do every day in our work. But there was the conversation, I love the comment about be unapologetic. Now, probably most of you are familiar with Justice Murray Sinclair, excuse me, who's now Senator Murray Sinclair. And he's a very inspiring speaker, but one of my favorite quotes from him, and I realize it's not an original quote, but love it, is, the truth will set you free, but first it's going to piss you off. And I think that in our work, if we're not pissing people off, we're clearly not trying hard enough. Not just for that purpose, but because if we're feeling comfortable, given all of the change that needs to happen, that Terry alluded to, that we'll be talking about today, then obviously we're not working hard enough. There was the conversation about, well, public officials need to be reelected, but we don't. I thought, well, you know what, that is partially true, but I hope that we will embrace the work that we're going to talk about here today as if we don't need the job. Because whether or not people need to be elected, I often see, and I get that, people have to feed their families, but the reality is, one of our elders at the Alberta School Board Association, one of the elders, Sykes Powderface, who's 84 years old, who's in Nakota, from Morley, and he always reminds us, as long as we talk about what is right and wrong instead of who is right and wrong, we'll all be able to be on that same path together. So I hope we can remember that. And then the other comment that I appreciated was about the gray hairs. And you know what, I learned something about gray hair though. It's probably because I'm getting some of that actually. Getting lots. For me it was always about educating young children. Educating the youth, because I felt like beating our heads against the wall with the adults and old people was a waste of our time. And I learned something through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I know Lewis and I were in the same rooms a lot here in Alberta, and Jennifer and I in Saskatchewan, that it was amazing and inspiring and very hopeful to me to see the number of gray-haired people that could have said, doesn't matter, it's not really going to affect, but they were the people who were leading alongside their grandchildren. So I also want us to remember that probably, I would say, in the period that we're in now, TRC and post-TRC, that the average 9-year-old probably knows more about what we're going to talk about today than the average 50-year-old. So with that, I would like to start with questions to my two friends. This worked out great. The people who organized this had no idea. They just invited the three of us, and we all know each other. So, and Terry's our friend from Manitoba, so that just worked out really interestingly that here we are. But people often ask, well, what is reconciliation? And even we talked about, Jennifer's going to speak a bit about the whole title of this, implementing reconciliation. Because that's what human beings can handle. Give me the definition, tell me what to do, and I'm going to go and do it. I'm going to check off the boxes and I'm going to go and do it. But I'm going to ask the two panelists to start with, as an ally and as an Indigenous person, as a Cree man, what does reconciliation mean to you? Jennifer, do you want to start?
Okay. Can everyone hear me? So thanks for that question, and it's one that I just want to say I don't have a definitive answer to, because it's something that I am thinking deeply about every day in the work that I do, professionally, but also in my personal life as I raise two daughters in a time of truth and reconciliation to know and do and be differently than I knew and did and was at their ages, because I was structurally denied opportunities to learn this important history. To go back to Terry's point earlier, not knowing this history or learning a particular version of history. And I just want to quickly situate myself in this because, as Charlene mentioned briefly, we share a connection from Saskatchewan. And so I was in Saskatchewan for 13 years. And for me, that is a significant place, Treaty 4, because it really, for me, was where I began to do this work in different ways. And I've been a high school teacher in Edmonton and just reproduced all of the dominant narratives, as you might imagine, in my own teaching. So I want to say first that I don't think reconciliation is something that can be implemented, as the title suggests. This is not mandated curriculum. This isn't a new law that's been passed and now has to be implemented. What for me is required is the creation of an ethos, a different way of knowing and being. It's shifting historical consciousness of mostly white settler Canadians. It requires deep, ongoing learning. It requires self-reflection, turning the mirror on ourselves. A scholar out of Lakehead University, Judy Isaac, has a beautiful piece called Cultural Mirrors made of paper mache. And she said that as settler peoples, we actually have to turn the mirror on ourselves and think about our own practices that contribute to ongoing colonialism and systems of oppression. And we also need to consider the significance of our relationships with and alongside Indigenous people. So reconciliation isn't a thing, it's a consciousness, it's an ethos, and it requires more than a single activity. It requires more than reading the book that you have been given, although that is an important beginning place and a place to come back to repeatedly as well, those 94 calls to action. And also because I am so grateful for the work of Marie Sinclair, it is going to take us 7 generations to heal from that work. So it is a lifetime's journey for me, and it will be a lifetime's journey for my children and their children as well. But I also want to say, and then I'll turn it over to Lewis because he just is amazing, and I'm always blown away by his thoughtfulness. I want to say that reconciliation isn't just about learning the history and legacies of residential schools. It actually requires us to confront racism and colonialism, as these things have existed not just in the past, but in the present moment. And I'm thinking just especially of my time in Saskatchewan around the murder of Colton Boushie and the incredible racist narratives that just bubbled right up to the surface in ways that I had not experienced before, though I have been well aware of racist thinking, particularly in a place like Saskatchewan, and I would say a place like Alberta too. It was so bad that the Premier, who I wouldn't put left of center or as an anti-racist thinker in any way, had to call for the population to exercise some decorum because it was divisive, it was hateful, it was hurtful, and I think it undid a lot of the good work we had been trying to do in Saskatchewan. So I'll stop and let Lewis answer.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate everybody being here today and willing to listen to some of the thoughts that we're going to share on reconciliation. And I do have to agree with you. Reconciliation is, well, first of all, how do you define that? It's a fundamental question. How do you implement it is an ongoing task if we implement it in itself. I want to... Oh, there's a powerful figure. Okay, so something, are we okay over there?
As far as I know.
All right. Okay, let's try that again. All right. Sorry. Up. Okay. All right. First, I want to acknowledge my ancestors. I'm a direct descendant of the treaty makers in Treaty Number 8, Mustas and Canusio. Mustas was my 4th great-grandfather, and Canusio was his brother. And the other brothers that made Treaty 8 in 1899 at Willow Point, which is on my First Nation in Sucker Creek. It comes with a history of story. And I also want to acknowledge here on Treaty 6 territory, my third great uncles, PostTRC and Michelle Callahan, who had reserves not far from here back in the day, and then they mysteriously disappeared. But that's another story. When I think about reconciliation, I think about these ancestors and what they had in mind when Canada was being thought of and being created. It also brings to mind what treaty means. And this is a very important concept that Canada has not yet engaged in. So first of all, we hear more and more, and I'll take partial responsibility for this in Edmonton, but when I was working with then Mayor Mandel, I had made the suggestion. I was the chair of the Edmonton Urban Aboriginal Affairs Committee at the time, and I said, why don't you acknowledge Treaty 6? But also acknowledge what its meaning is. So that's what really started everything happening here. And then Don Iveson, when he was elected, had me write the Indigenous portion of his inaugural speech, which then set the tone for the rest of the City Hall to start to acknowledge Treaty 6 territory, which I think is a good half step forward. But the other step, or the rest of the step, is understanding what treaty is. I feel honored that treaty is being spoken about, and mostly all of our gatherings now, here and across Western Canada for sure. But what they're missing is what treaty means. And I think treaty then becomes the counterpoint to reconciliation, if you will, or maybe the connotation of reconciliation. Because treaty, when we made treaty, these are very sacred ceremonies that we participated in. They were witnessed by the Creator, as our elders and our medicine people talked about. They were covenants between nations, and more, they were adoption ceremonies. Our people, through our custom of making treaties, because we were making treaties long before Europeans came, but the way we saw it was different. We made treaties before conflict would arise, not after conflict, which basically defines contemporary treaties, especially in Western Europe. But we saw the wisdom in realizing that if we do not create a better path with the other people that we may have conflict with, we are going to go down a dark path. So treaty then becomes a relationship agreement. It becomes a sacred covenant. Treaty can be said to be sacred text because it sets the foundation of relationship. And so you are then my family. You are, by that tradition of adoption, are actually my brothers and sisters. And when you read history on treaty and you read about the Indigenous concepts of treaty, it's always about brothers and sisters walking side by side. The very first treaty was called the Two-Row Wampum, which tells the story of two great ships going down a river. And this was between the Mi'kmaq and the Dutch in 1643, I think it was. Don't correct me. Around there. And what that said was that these two ships will share this great river of life. And they will be joined together by peace, friendship, and understanding. We will not get into your boat and steer it and tell it where to go. Neither will you come into our canoe and steer our boat. But we will share this great river of life together and all the abundance that it has to offer. That was the very first treaty. Then when you look at subsequently to all the rest of the treaties, they talk about peace and friendship and understanding as being the core principles of those things. And I think when we look at treaty as a framework of reconciliation, that's where we're really going to see change happen. In June 2008, I had the serendipitous experience of actually being in the House of Commons when the apology was being read. And I was in Ottawa for a totally different reason. I was speaking at the World Forum on Public Relations or something like that. And I was done early. I was done at like 9:30. So the organizer said, go, take the rest of the day off, come back for dinner. I said, okay, so what am I going to do? We're right at the hotel, the Frontenac, right beside the hill. So I thought, well, I'm going to go walk by the hill and see if there's any relatives protesting in front of me. So I went over there, sure as heck, there were like hundreds of them out there. First person I walked up to is a relative of mine, you know, so it's kind of like, hey, what are you guys doing? Oh, he said, today's the big day where we're going to have the apology read to us. And I said, oh, that's right. I totally forgot about it, right? And I said, geez, I'd like to go in, you know. He goes, well, guess what? I have one ticket left. So we made our way in, and I was up in some rafter somewhere, and happened to look down and asked the question, why am I here? And my father's voice came into my head, and he said, listen to what's being said here. My father passed away 10 days before that, and so it really struck me that when the apologies were read and our leaders were in the center of the chamber, it made me realize that my work is to work in that reconciliation, but to work at a grassroots level, not so much as a political level, but at a grassroots level, because that's where things are going to change. And shortly after that, I spoke with Elijah Harper, the late Elijah Harper, one of my heroes, and one of my mentors, and I asked him this question, so what do you think of this TRC thing and this apology? And he said this, and this really lit the fuse for me. He said, this country will never achieve reconciliation until the people sit and talk with each other. And I think that's just a fundamental thing and that important that we can sit here and speak with you and you can speak with us. I think that's the first step towards reconciliation, which is more of a verb than it is a noun.
Shanice, thank you. I hope that in this time, as much as you can be so drawn in, because both Jennifer and Lewis are such great speakers, and you feel like you're part of that conversation, I'm going to ask you to keep in your mind, what does this have to do with me? Because whether or not you know it, it does. It has something to do with every one of us here. In your own lives, as you've been invited, but also in your work. And so, as Lewis spoke, it brought to mind a couple of things about territory acknowledgement and identity. And people are really starting to do territory acknowledgement more and more. And you know, as Lewis invites, it's so important to understand why. But I often hear people, and I'm not sure if you hear this as well, but I often hear people say, well, we don't have to acknowledge the territory every time we have a meeting, or every time we have a gathering, every time we speak, because I feel like it's sort of disingenuous. So I just want you to reflect on this for yourselves. I'm not saying this is it, but my thought is always, you know what, you're right. Why do we single Canada and everything? Everybody knows we're in it. Everybody knows this is Canada. It's so disingenuous to just stand up and sing to that flag every time we do something. And suddenly when that mirror is, oh, wait a minute, we're talking about my identity now as opposed to yours. And as Lewis pointed out, that really isn't a thing. It's ours. And we're different parts of that. So I also want you to reflect on identity. We're all, as Lewis explained really beautifully, we're all members of Treaty 6, or 7, or 8, depending on where you live here in Alberta. And sometimes people are a little taken aback by that and say, well, I don't really feel like I can acknowledge myself as a member of Treaty 8 or Treaty 7. You know, that I don't feel like that's respectful. It's like, okay, well, how many sides does a treaty have? Pretty difficult to have a treaty if only the people that are First Nation are the members of that treaty. But again, I think to reflect back on, and so I ask people, do you consider yourself to be Canadian? I say, well, of course. I say, well, you do realize that's not a heritage. You do realize that's not a culture, it's a passport. It's a nationality. But it is actually not a heritage, and yet we consider that part of our identity. So can we not then, and should we not then, recognize that part of each of us, our identity, is that we are a member of a particular territory. The only other thing I want to comment on from what Jennifer spoke about, as far as putting it back to you, is talking about that implementation or the process and that ethos. And this is not to be disrespectful, but just an observation. When I walk in the room, the first thing I do is look to see, and let's all be clear that we cannot look and tell visibly who is Indigenous in this room and who is not. However, you know, there are I'm going to probably guess that there are not a large number, from my review here, of Indigenous people. People want to read the calls to action, which, by the way, you can download those for free. There's a PDF on the internet. You don't have to pay the $7. However, do whatever makes you happy. They're beautiful. But people can handle that. We can handle, what am I going to do that is external to my life? Even if we don't do that purposefully, that's sort of a human condition. Well, what is the activity as opposed to what Jennifer spoke to as far as what is that internal process? Call to action 57, absolutely, calls on public servants to be educated. But when we're thinking about reconciliation and what does that look like in the implementation, we need to look at that structurally as well. And I think one of the most damaging words in these conversations that we're being invited to have by both Jennifer and Lewis is "but." Right? We have conversations with people and they're well-meaning and they're interested and they're engaged and they want to learn things because that's taking something external or seeing something that needs to happen that's external. And then the next comment is usually, but this is the way we do things. In which case I always say to people, we might as well save our time and just say, I actually don't care about Indigenous people. It's not important to us in our work, so let's just all be honest, because that's the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation, and move on. So just a few things to ask you to use to sort of frame when you're thinking about what will we do when we leave here, because believe me, Lewis and Jennifer will be inviting you to do some things. So with that, Lewis, before I get to the next question from both of us, both of you, I'm wondering, Jennifer did a great lead into this, I think. You know, people in education, those of you that are in education, I think we all know when people talk about treaty education, everybody says, Saskatchewan's amazing. They've been doing treaty education for years and years and years. And they have. And yet, it's still acceptable and legal to shoot a First Nation kid in the back of the head because you think that you know what he's thinking and you think he's thinking something that is bad. So what is the actual action out of that? So I think that in the work that we get to do, because we're surrounded by people that are of like mind and work, and we can start to feel almost comfortable, a little bit good about what's happening in the shift in this country. And then Colton Bushi, and then Tina Fontaine, and then every day, and those are just the kids that we hear about. So I want to ask Lewis, we are now 2.5 years post-TRC, after 6.5 years of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. From your perspective as a Cree person, where do you feel like we're kind of at from what you're seeing as far as on that path of reconciliation?
I think we're still at the starting gate. There is a lot of work to be done. While we bandy the word reconciliation around quite easily, the immensity of the work is just starting to hit home for a lot of people. And as you were saying, the work, or the mirror, as we turn it on ourselves, really is the personal work. We can't leave this reconciliation in the hands of our politicians. We have to internalize it ourselves. We have to internalize that spirit and intent of the treaty. Treaty in action is what I call these kind of movements. It's to go back to that principle of relationship. There are a lot of well-meaning organizations that will move ahead and do positive things, and we heard some of that, putting up flags and recognizing things, but we have to get into a deeper space. We have to have a more challenged conversation with each other, particularly around racism and the legacy behind it as well. These are tough conversations that we have to have as Canadians, because that's where we're really going to make the changes, is when the change happens to you. Not just legislation, not just policy, but the change needs to happen to you. So each one of you have to make that movement into reconciliation. And there's many strategies and many different things that we can do to address that. And there are some wonderful opportunities that are being developed. But also to let you know, it isn't about just you moving in that direction, but it's also me and my people moving in that direction as well. Again, back to that treaty theme, walking side by side together like brothers and sisters. That includes this trip of reconciliation that we're on.
I really appreciate that because I often believe when people say, well, how will we know when we're on that path and when we're getting to reconciliation? And my response is generally when we see, which we actually wouldn't see, but when parents are speaking differently at the dinner table to their children or to their significant others or people in their families, when nobody else is watching, when nobody else is listening, and it's not a requirement of their employment or the politically correct thing to say. So I really appreciate that. And which really leads beautifully into, Jennifer, anything that you'd like to add to that, but also how you see your role as an ally.
Yeah, so I'm going to add a little bit more to this process of engaging in reconciliation, and then I'll talk about my role as an ally. And I anticipated the question, so I wrote some things down so I would not misrepresent the words of others. So we've been talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they do, closer? There, that's better. Yes. Sorry. So the TRC does have a statement about reconciliation as establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country, which requires an awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So it goes back to Lewis's earlier point about the importance of ethical relationality and being alongside one another in this work. So I want to borrow some words of one of my master's students who did a beautiful thesis, which is available for all of you to read on her website. Her name is Claire Kruger, spelled Kreuger, and if you search it up, you'll go right to her blog. And her thesis uses a colonial alphabet, A to Z, to consider her own journey to thinking about and engaging in reconciliation as a white settler teacher in Treaty 4. And she makes the following argument. She says, despite this fairly comprehensive definition of reconciliation offered by the TRC, and despite the 94 detailed and specific calls to action, we Canadians seem to be somewhat at a loss as to what exactly we should be doing to promote reconciliation. Page. She goes on to trouble what she calls reconciliation efforts that are superficial or are redwashing. And this is not her word, this is the word of an Indigenous scholar, which is the process of engaging in superficial acts of reconciliation that are feel-good for us, white settlers, but that fail to engage ongoing processes of colonialism and racism in our society. So Claire asks, as individual Canadians, how much of what we are doing under the umbrella of reconciliation is actually redwashing. And I think that that's something we have to really think about. Are we doing an activity? Are we feeling good about it? And then do we think we've done reconciliation? And Pam Palmater makes the argument that if it feels good, it's probably not really reconciliation. So that's something that I would ask you just to think about. And it's something that I continue to think about on an ongoing basis as someone who's trying to be an ally to Indigenous people. And one of the ways in which I try to be an ally is by being accountable for my own white settler privilege through my position as someone who has some influence in education in this province. And as a teacher educator in Saskatchewan and as Dean of the Faculty of Education at the U of R and now at U of A, I have an obligation, an ethical imperative to ensure that the work that is happening in my faculty is attentive to the ongoing history and legacies of colonialism and racism, and that we are supporting one another to learn, because the learning is ongoing, that we recognize we will make mistakes. There will be missteps in this work. But that cannot be, nor should it be, an excuse to not do the work. As teachers, we expect our children, our students, to make mistakes every day. But then when we become adults, we seem to be mistake avoidant. And so I also think, though, an argument could be made that using mistakes or the worry about making mistakes as a reason not to engage in this work is actually a really strong structuring force of coloniality that allows the current condition to be perpetuated. So for me, it is trying to use my position in good ways, but always in dialogue with, in consultation with, and alongside Indigenous peoples, because those relationships are really critical. So I'll stop there.
So as Jennifer shared her thoughts around white privilege, it reminded me of something that happened to me not so far from here, not so far at all. A few weeks ago, I was invited to a high school, which I rarely get the opportunity to do anymore because there's so much work to be done. But when I was asked if I would come and speak to 140 grade 11 students, and I always think that the younger people are, the less undoing we have to do. So I think it's a good use of our time. So I was asked to go to this high school and speak to these 140 grade 11 students. And not so long before that, I had some discussions with some people who were quite upset about an Indigenous scholar that we all know, I'm not going to name, that had talked about privilege as he was doing a keynote. And it was a feel-good conversation. And the people that were in the room, much like this, that left, out of the entire room, there were 4 Indigenous people in that room from Western Canada. And it was so interesting to me because we were all, I was there again, like you had been, for something completely different, that we all know each other and saw each other at the airport. And all the white people were so happy, and I can say that. White people were so happy. And they said it was so great. And he said that reconciliation shouldn't be uncomfortable. And I was a little bit worried about that. And let's remember, and Jennifer said, you know, about if it feels, Pam Palmer talks about if it feels good, it's probably not reconciliation. Maybe if it feels right. I think there's a difference. And I think that we need to remember that uncomfortable and bad are not the same things. Unsettled and uncomfortable means we're actually thinking and moving and reflecting. So it was very interesting that these people had said, and then the 4 Indigenous people that I knew from these organizations each stopped by at different times, had not spoken with each other, and each wanted to sit and vent about how frustrated they were. And I was a little frustrated, I have to tell you, because I'm a little bit less than gentle, can we say that? And I thought, great, if an Indigenous scholar just made these statements, now when I do call people to action, they get to say, no, it's okay because this First Nation person said this. So anyway, I carried those thoughts with me as I spoke to these grade 11 students, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to make sure that they understand what white privilege is. Because this keynote speaker had stated that, you know, his daughter too has privilege, even though she's First Nation, both of her parents are First Nation, because of their work and their position. And I've had to explain that to all of my children many times, that, you know, we all know that privilege is a range. So I spoke to these students and talked about white privilege and explained that white privilege doesn't mean you're a bad person. My dear friend Jennifer is a great example. You can be the most incredible ally in the world, the most humble ally in the world. You can't give it away. Darn it, it is not something that you get to detach from yourself and say, but I don't want white privilege. It doesn't mean you look down on people. You are born with it, you have it, and as Jennifer beautifully explained, use it for the right reasons to do good things. Not things that you can say you did with good intentions that feel good, but to do those right things. About a week later, the principal emailed me. 4 days later, the principal emailed me and said, can we chat? I called him. He said, I just thought you should know I got a call from a parent. I thought, okay, I'm waiting for the news. And the parent was upset because you talked about white privilege. Okay, still waiting for the news. We're in Alberta. And he said, well, I just thought I should let you know because you know, he was upset because when you single out a a particular group, that's reverse racism. Thank you for all getting that. I just thought, oh God, help us, where do we start here? So he said, I just wanted you to be able to, think about that. I want to let you know. First of all, I thought, you clearly haven't researched who you have to speak, because if you think that you obviously don't know what we do every single day and you get pushback. I kind of felt like the news it was only one parent. Like, I thought that was so cool. He had an easy day. No news that the parent was, pushing back. I was trying to be calm because I'm getting old and I'm really working on being more calm. So I'm like, walking around, I'm, waiting, responding. And I said to him, oh, well, it's okay, thanks anyways, but I don't need to think about it. I can already tell you won't be changing the language. That's not going to happen. White privilege is a real thing. I'd love to take credit for coming up with the term myself. I didn't think of it as I was driving to your school. And yeah, we will be talking about it because it's important. Thank you. Hung up. I'm getting ready to go to a meeting, and the more I'm walking around, the more annoyed I am. So I called him back. It was a half an hour, maybe. And I think the poor guy thought I was calling him back to say, I thought about it, yeah, right. Poor fool. So he said, oh yeah, I said who I was. And I said, I just want to be clear. I hope I didn't project this. I think you called me to suggest that I might not use the term white privilege and explain that when I'm speaking to students. And he goes, well, yeah, that was my help. I said, okay, thank you. He goes, well, no, but I also wanted to just say to you that, this parent was upset. And I said, oh, yeah, that's okay, that's not the news. I just want to be clear that an education leader was suggesting that I not tell the truth when I teach kids. I just hope that we all don't worry about that one person that's going to push back. There's going to be a whole bunch. And what we have to remember, I know for us in the field, and I would say for all of you, is those people are a gift to us. Although you want to choke them at the time, but they are a gift to us. Because they remind us that we can never get comfortable. That it could look really good because we're doing great work where we're sitting, but that there's so much more to do. So on that, my next question to Jennifer and Lewis is, can you share some of the really good practices or some really great things that you've seen happen that really are leading to that deeper level of reflection and implementation and process of reconciliation?
Okay. Reconciliation cannot happen without justice, and that's an important thing that we have to remember. It cannot happen without repatriation. It cannot happen without restoration. It cannot happen without recovery. These are elements that we need to have into place when we talk about reconciliation in that broader scope. But it also can't happen if we don't share the stories with each other. See, I have this thing about the microphone. Oh, I don't want to break that one either.
We won't have one left.
Try it again.
Okay. All right. Okay. Where was I?
Share stories.
Yeah. Because we need to be able to share stories with each other because we're human beings, and it's said in a lot of our traditions that stories invented us so that we can carry them. And each of us have stories. And so we do some very basic sort of things. And when we talk about how are we going to do this reconciliation, adjusting your governing principles is a lot of work, and it sounds really impressive. But what is even more impressive is when you sit and you talk and you listen to each other, as Indigenous and allies do, and you start to share stories. Because what happens there is that when you start to see yourself in another person's story, that's that first thread of relationship. You start to understand each other more deeply than just being someone from across the table. You start to recognize yourself. That's how important and how simple reconciliation can be taken. But it's also difficult work, because in that part of restoration and repair that we need to do within our relationship with Canada, this fundamental part of person-to-person relationships is going to be that foundation, is that cornerstone. So some of the work that I do with my children. My children have grown up to be fine young radicals, I must say. But they're smart and they know technology, so it makes me look even better. But they created this idea, my daughter did specifically, called Tatawao. And Tatawao in Cree means welcome, there is room. That's a fundamental principle amongst our people. Tatawao, welcome, there is room. And you probably heard a variation of there's always room in the circle. It comes from the same thing. There's always room for people to join you in the circle. And so what we do is that we go to organizations, will call us, and we'll go in and we'll do about a 3-hour session talking about treaty and how to be a good treaty person. And treaty in action is where that phrase kind of came out, because we're developing relationships, because we also realized that there's a lot of allies who want to do good and right things, but they just don't know how. So Tatawao then became that process where we, Indigenous people, would go sit with them in their space, bring our stories, bring our knowledge about treaty and treaty rights and various different concepts to do that fundamental piece of education that isn't being done yet on a large scale. Because then when you bring it down to that personal relationship, again, you start to make stronger threads. Because allies can also become political allies. They can become partners, and relationships can flourish from that common ground that you're sitting on. And so with Tatawao then, I think we've done about 20 of them in the last year. It's just going from one organization to another. Sometimes we do up to 16 per session, and it kind of gets unruly. But difficult discussions can happen there as well, talking about justice. The one thing that you reminded me of, Charlene, is the statement that, well, I have no responsibility for that. That happened 100 years ago. It's not my responsibility. So when I hear that from students or other people, I say, well, you know, I don't have any responsibility for the national debt, so I'm not going to pay anything into it because it's not my responsibility. We have to reframe things like that in that context to say, you know what, reconciliation is a national debt, and we all have to pay a little piece to make sure that we bring it into balance.
I'm not sure I can follow that, Lewis. So I'll share a couple of stories, just quickly about some of the work that I think is making a real difference, and Charlene will be familiar. And I apologize that most of my stories at this point come from Treaty 4 in Saskatchewan and not yet Treaty 6 in Alberta. I'm still learning some of the good work that's happening here. But there's a project out of southern Saskatchewan called Treaty 4, The Next Generation. And Charlene knows about it because she was invited to speak at the youth conference in that first year. And these were newly graduated teachers, relatively, 3-4 years out. And shortly after, we had begun in teacher education to introduce treaties and the treaty relationship to thinking about what it means to teach in southern Saskatchewan. And so they applied for a small grant to bring students together to really think forward about what it means to be treaty people together. And the first year, I think there were 50 or 60 youth involved. Yeah, and it was a full day at First Nations University, and there was some really beautiful learning alongside Indigenous peoples and allies. And then the next year it expanded, and then the next year it expanded. And the young people who were involved in that have a different way of thinking about themselves as treaty people as a result. And it goes back to Lewis's earlier point about the need to understand the significance, the historical and contemporary significance of treaties and the treaty relationship, but also how treaties are so critical to our shared future together in this province and indeed throughout the country. So that's one example. And then another example that I'll share is, well, actually, I think I'm going to use an example from here because I'm really heartened that the new teacher quality standards, which are going to be implemented in fall 2019, include Objective 5, which is an expectation that all teachers in Alberta, pre-service, in-service, it doesn't matter if you've been teaching 1 year, you're a beginning teacher, or you've been teaching 30 years, you will have to find meaningful ways to integrate First Nations, Métis, and Inuit content, knowledge, and perspectives in your classroom. And a standard under that objective is an expectation for treaty education in this province, and that teachers will be taking that work up. So in anticipation of that, my daughter's teacher, grade 4 teacher, sent a note home to me through my daughter saying, I know that you've done lots of work in treaty education, and we're really wanting some help. Can you talk with us? So that's hopeful to me. That's so hopeful to me. So there is, I think, a desire amongst many white settler teachers and many white settlers to think and do differently, recognizing the limitations in our own knowledge, but that there are opportunities to address those limitations. And I have a little list and then I'll stop talking, but these are some of the things I think we need to do to create the conditions for educational change, because as an educator, I do see the power of K-12 and other educational contexts for moving us forward in good ways. So I think we have to intentionally connect with and learn from Indigenous peoples and communities in respectful and ethical ways. We have to recognize the limits of our own knowledge. We have to learn to listen with humility, with open hearts and open minds. We have to walk together as treaty people. We have to challenge ignorance, our own and in others. We have to create opportunities for conversation about our colonial past and our present. We have to respond to resistance. And Charlene just described such a powerful example of resistance, from the parent to the conversation about white privilege, but also the principal as well. Students will resist, families resist, colleagues resist, leaders resist, and we have to be prepared to speak up. We have to shift out of deficit discourses to describe Indigenous peoples and Indigenous learners in schools. They are strong and beautiful and have so much to offer. We have to recognize where people are at, and we have to create multiple entry points and invitations for truth and reconciliation work. It is not about blame and shame. It is about, as Elder Star Blanket reminds me all the time, responsibility. And we have to remember that truth and reconciliation work is ongoing. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you. Lewis's continual reminders about the importance of relationship and dialogue brings you back again to one of the teachings from Sykes Powderface, one of our oldest elders. And he's an elder, I want to remind you, give you the context, that led a lot of the work around the Section 35 of the Constitution. And he says to us, and reminds us all the time, when you put the words on the paper, that's where the words then die. He says because the spirit is gone then from the words, because you have to then go find another document and another document that are discontinued or disconnected if you want to know what that means. But in that conversation, the words still have spirit, because you can have that dialogue to continue to understand where that's connected. We are going to be moving now to some questions from you. And I think Brett is the keeper of the microphone.
The talking stick.
Oh yes, sorry, Lewis reminded us it's the electronic talking stick.
I'm not going to stand up because I have a really wonky knee, but my name is Marie Aiken, and I'm from United Nurses of Alberta, and I want to get back to the Colton Boucher thing, because we just had an incident in southern Alberta of a tragedy that happened to a First Nations family, and on social media, one of our MLAs, who happens to be NDP, who happens to be a nurse, put out there if anybody has any trauma with this, that they could get in touch with 811. Now, if it had been a high school shooting or something like that, that same information would have been put out there. But a UCP politician attacked him for doing that and said, oh, you're making this a political thing. And I basically responded to him and said, it doesn't matter who the person was, who the family was. This was a tragedy, and people need to have the information that if they're seeking some outside support and help, and that's all this person was doing. And so we have to fight those kind of things. The other thing is I was recently at the Justice Film Festival. I don't know if you know about it, but it's a film festival that occurs out of Marteloup in Calgary and in Fort Macleod in Alberta, southern Alberta. One of the films that was there was called The Road Forward. It's a National Film Board film. It was awesome. And I recommend anybody, if you have a chance to see it, to go and look at it. There was an elder there who spoke afterwards. That's what's really great about the film festival, is they do have talking people afterwards. But I just find that I believe the white privilege is a real thing, although my son will argue with me, but he's more like a libertarian. So we have major battles on that. But I just wanted to comment on that National Film Board film. It's not online yet. You have to go to the National Film Board's site and see where it's being shown. But it's really good. And then I just wanted to say, call out these people that say things that we shouldn't be saying. We shouldn't be acting like that. We're all human beings. We all bleed red blood.
Thank you. So a couple of things there. First of all, when we talked at the very beginning about reconciliation, what is that? Jennifer and I have had this discussion many times, that, you know, reconciliation happens in families, and people recognize that reconciliation needs to happen in First Nation, Métis, and Inuit families that have been impacted by residential schools. But reconciliation needs to happen in families where people argue at the dinner table about whether or not white privilege is really a thing. So I think, you know, that's a really important thing to remember. And then just a little tip for you, Justice Sinclair, Senator Sinclair just tweeted not long ago, I loved it, and it said, white privilege, and he was quoting an American sports coach, it said, white privilege has been defined as being born on third base and thinking that you hit a triple. Do we have anything?
Scott McDougall, HSA. You know, when Lewis was talking about the direct connection to his ancestors that signed the treaty, I'm thinking that this is really part and parcel of the problem for settler families, because in many respects they can't identify a signatory because typically there wasn't one. This was a signatory of the colonial state in Britain, who, you know, I think if we look at this with a different lens, we can also see that the settlers that arrived here were also colonized people from their own administrators. You know, and I think the one piece of this argument where I see Public Interest Alberta, all our unions and other things can really come on board is in two ways. One is understanding the economic colonization that started a process hundreds of years ago, but that continues today regardless of you know, our racial background here in North America. So as we begin that conversation of economic colonization alongside this other conversation and the recognition of our own colonization as settler people, I think that moves the conversation that we need to have together in terms of reconciliation miles and miles. The other thing that struck me is when we get this resistance about the word white privilege, I think that's also sort of a canary in the coal mine that suggests that many white folks, because they're more easily able to navigate the system, somehow believe that they are not as equally oppressed, or not, I shouldn't say equally, oppressed by these same features that are also part of them really pushing back against this notion of privilege. Well, I don't feel privileged because, shit, I haven't had a job for 3 years, so what are you talking about my privilege? It's a distortion of that, but I think underneath it, there's some of that similarity that if we can get to understanding our own stories, being able, you know, and I remember an elder saying one time that for a lot of us settlers, we don't have an easy road back to our story. For Indigenous folks, the connections are here. Lots of times the stories have been able to be maintained and sustained through the course of families, but our road is a long road home. And I think we've lost lots of that connection to that, and therefore lost a lot of the connection to the story, and therefore lots of this misunderstanding about our own participation as treaty peoples in this conversation. I'm
actually going to ask both Jennifer and Lewis to speak to that a little bit, because I feel like it's something that happens often when people then want to include Indigenous experience and challenges in something called diversity, and I just like to remind people that there's only one group of people in this country that has a unique situation. So, Lewis, you want to go first? I see you got your mic.
Yeah, just because it might break. You know, reconciliation, just in a basic term for me, is in any given situation, you want to return something that may have been stolen, that you may have taken. You return it. When you break something, you fix it, you repair it. These are just some fundamental ideas in terms of how we can look at this again. And when I think about, well, I was shocked to learn about my own male privilege. Now that was a head spinner for me. To realize I have this male privilege thing. And it was my daughter who brought it to my attention. You know, the kindest, most gentle way, she asked me that question at the dinner table. You know, how do you enjoy your male privilege? I said, what? I worked hard to get where I, you know. That's reconciliation, right? And so I listened and I understood, and it brought me back to my grandfather who taught me when I was 14. He said, it will be woman who teaches you how to be warrior. And he's right. So I'll pass it on.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure that I can add anything more to that. One of the things that I will say, though, because I thought a lot about, you know, what it means to be a settler in treaty territory, and I agree that settler histories are complex histories too, but I think that what we have to come back to is how it was that we came to be here in the first place. How was the land available for us to settle, and how are my social and economic privileges today directly connected to the signing of the numbered treaties, regardless of whether I had an ancestor involved in treaty negotiations or not. I benefit every day from those treaty negotiations.
And I think that when we start to feel like, you know, and I think this has been the environment in Alberta for some time now about the oil thing. You know, my brother works in the oil field, and you know, one of my mom's comments about people not having work, I said, oh, damn. Now people actually have to live like other people, like everybody else that doesn't have 7 TVs, you only can have 3. That's really terrible. But I think that we need to remember that even when white people struggle, and we see those things that we have in common, we also need to remember that at least when you walk in the store, nobody's following you. And you don't get to go and sit in the emergency ward of the hospital and be dead for 4 hours before anybody comes to see if you're okay, and the list goes on. So yes, there are some things that are common. However, let's think about that whole entire foundational difference before we get to that piece.
I just want to, with my other rant, it was going somewhere, and where it was going is to the statement of the loss of the stories. You know, the stories are not far away from you. You know, you have to be able to open yourself up to that. And the way that you get to that, and one way that we can do as an action, is to do reconciliation through genealogy. About 40% of Canadians have an Indigenous person in their family tree somewhere. Find out who that person is. Find out what were their conditions during their lifetime. That way you will find a stronger connection to what these issues are. And that understanding is going to help you to be a better ally and also a better person. Because I've done my research and my genealogy, and I can go back to the Cardinal family, for example, goes to Spain. The Cardinal family name is a Sephardic Jewish name. And that blew me away too. But what that did is it invited me to go to those roots and start to read about Jewish history, Spanish history, French history. So it connected me in a different way in how I see then those allies that are here that are my relatives.
So I'm not looking towards Joel, because I think he's going to say we're just about out of time, but I was watching the clock when the break was finished. And I kind of feel like it was a little late. So we're not going to take too long. But maybe we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll just sort of wrap it up with some calls to action.
Hi, my name is Yvonne. I'm with Health Sciences. I love that Lewis mentioned that we have to build our own relationships on personal levels. And after participating at Blue Quills, I realized how little I knew. I have found a tool that's really helping me, that's really helping me to understand this reconciliation a little bit better. And I'm going to mention this. I'm probably not the only person in this room, but it's called next150.indianhorse.ca. Once a week on Monday I get a challenge, and so far they've sent out 9 challenges. I've completed 7 of the 9. For example, on whose land? The next one was a moose hide campaign, which my board of directors is going to see something next week at our meeting. Amplify youth voices, understanding UNDRIP, Indigenous reads, diversify your news, Indigenous art in public, Indigenous storytelling mixtape, and Bannock challenge. I have to admit I've completed 7 of the 9, partially because I always still get my daughter to do my own mixtapes, and it's not something that I'm good at. And the other is I hate cooking, so I have not completed the Bannock challenge. But it is really interesting, and it's really helping me to understand, and it's a simple thing, comes out once a week, and you can accept the challenge or not. So I just thought I'd mention that, and I have to admit it's really opening my eyes to a lot of things, and I feel like I'm understanding things a lot better.
Thank you. So that'll be something that you could do so that you could be ready to start deeper reconciliation. That's great. So we'll have one more. Do we have one more person? Oh. Brett. Oh. Were you heading towards someone, Brett, or were you just hoping to find someone? Okay, well, they must have got hungry, so go ahead to the other one.
Well, I feel really bad now for keeping everyone from lunch.
Oh, no, please continue.
So, as part of my work with the Edmonton Social Planning Council, we recently did a series of interviews with Indigenous seniors. And this is a community-based research project. And one of the things that is a common theme in this work is this strong sense of mistrust, because there has been a long history of abuse. And a lot of the seniors, without us even asking them, talked about the history of violence in residential schools. They talk about how that trauma is passed on to their children, who will then pass it on to their children. And so I wanted to ask, what are some ways that as people who are aspiring to be allies, how can we help to overcome this history and to build that trust that has been damaged for so long?
Thank you. That's a great question. Lewis, you're on.
Don't try.
You're
Okay.
next.
That's the question. It's well, we know that trauma unaddressed is transferred, and so the process of addressing the trauma is a part of the healing process. And the only real answer that we have is time. We need to take that time to have our healing. This is a part of the work that we have to do as Indigenous people as well, because that pain and that trauma, is easily turned into anger. If you don't address it, you don't create those spaces and opportunities to address it. And I've had a chance to work with a number of elders, and I've heard that same statement before. There's a lot of mistrust. But we have to start somewhere in having these dialogues and supporting programs and programming within institutions and within seniors' homes and that, where they can have that space to be able to have that conversation about where it is. And that's going to be a part of the healing process as we move along. A lot of trauma and pain has been transferred to younger generations. And there's all kinds of research and study that prove that transfer. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to add anything?
No, I don't think there's anything I can add to that.
So just before we wrap up, I have asked each of my colleagues and friends here to think about calls to action. I think that the Commission came up with their 94 calls to action, and that was the short list, I would suggest. So leading into that, for me, I would like to invite and challenge you to think about, as you're reflecting on your own organizations, decolonizing your human resource practices. I would really invite you to think about what that means, which then leads you to I believe, think about define qualified. The easy part is sending somebody to a colonial or Eurocentric institution like a university. My friend understands that very well, she lives in it. That's the easy part. We can send people, they're everywhere. If we've got the money and the will, we can send people to post-secondary institutions. The qualifications that are very difficult to come by are those qualifications that people have been acquiring and earning their entire lives. So I really want you to think about, is reconciliation decolonizing our HR practices? How do we define qualified within those processes, including, I'm just going to stop there because I'll have your whole list, I'll take up your whole list. Lewis.
Calls to action?
To this group.
Yes. Since I've been talking a lot about stories and the importance of stories, I'm also a trained journalist, and I believe that the media has an important, a very vital role in how the big narrative is shaped. And so when we do read stories, my challenge is to not to take those stories at face value. It takes a little bit of work to kind of cross-check things, but have different perspectives on what some of these stories are before they do spin out of control. And also, try not to read the comments on Facebook sometimes. Yeah, your blood pressure goes up.
Yeah.
But that's all I can think about right now.
Well, and because I always come back to my educator lens, I guess my challenge to each one of you in the room is to leave here with a commitment to read something to help you become better educated about these issues. And also, if you have children in the school division and they are not coming home with new learnings, these important learnings, I would challenge you to engage their teachers and school leaders in these conversations as well.
Thank you. So as you go back after tomorrow? Tonight? It's Friday. I guess as you go back next week to your work and think about, that how many people have seen that poster where there's the polar bear laying there and says, sometimes I get really excited about doing something different and then I lay down until the feeling goes away. Don't do that. When you go back next week, as you're thinking about how many Indigenous people are in this room, how many Indigenous people are in your organizations, what's that voice? If somebody in your group, as you're having that discussion, says, but we really don't have an Indigenous position, or we're not really dealing with things that are specifically Indigenous. I'm not sure, A, how it happens that you're not engaging with Indigenous people. And secondly, regardless of what you're doing or not doing, whether you have that position, you need an Indigenous voice, multiple Indigenous voices in the conversation, regardless of what you're talking about. So I hope that those are some things that you'll take back. Some great, great stories and suggestions and ideas. And when we're thinking about that education, how many people here know what the blanket exercise is? Okay, so there's a way to learn. I know that when Jennifer was the Dean of Education at U of R, all students, all teacher candidates did the blanket exercise. I'm going to share this last thought with you before you get to eat. The blanket exercise is a very interactive, engaging way of learning, a very beginning learning about our collective colonial history in this country. I was at a gathering here in Edmonton about a year ago, and a woman came up and spoke to me, and she said, I did the blanket exercise, and it was actually the third time I did it, and I still learned something. She said, one of my colleagues said, I'm not going to go there because I already did that. She checked off the box. She was on her way to reconciliation. She said, when we left, the facilitator did a great job and said, I want you, before you leave here, to release, to let go of the role that you were in. This is not who you are. Because there was a European, there's a narrator, and the young First Nation woman said, I wish I could release and walk out of this experience, because it's not who I am. It is who I am. It's my life every day. So as we're thinking about that privilege and that opportunity, think about it every day when you leave work, as you're going home, as you're entering into these conversations. I hope you don't release that. I hope we carry those things with us. And I just want to thank you so much. I want to thank Jennifer and Lewis. Not only for the time here, but for what they do every single day. And I want to thank you in advance, because I know that every one of you is going to go back and you're going to make that significant change over that long period of time that Lewis and Jennifer both talked about, in your workplace, in your home, and in your community. Shanish Pinaman.
And I want to say thank you so much to all three of you for sharing such a wealth of knowledge and experiences and insights, and really challenging, I think, all of us here to do more and to be much more conscious about these conversations. So thank you, Charlene, Jennifer, and Lewis.